Since his conviction for Sarah's abduction, rape and murder, Couzens has been convicted of further crimes of indecent exposure, one of which he had already been linked to while a serving police officer.
If everyone who committed one murder, like police officer Wayne Couzens, got a whole life prison sentence, instead of there being 83 whole life prisoners, there'd be hundreds and hundreds. The unique horror and brutality to the single victim murder cases that you're about to meet then are why they earned the perpetrators a forever sentence, the case of Wayne Couzens being where we start. Presenting a cop-turned-killer.
At the moment you're under arrest, okay? I'm accusing of kidnapping at this time. Okay, so you didn't have to say anything, but no harm in your defence. You did not mention one question, something later on in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence.
Wayne Couzens was a Metropolitan Police officer who, on the 3rd of March 2021, down in Clapham, South London, stopped a random woman on the street whose name was Sarah Everard and who was a 33-year-old marketing executive, falsely told her that she was in breach of lockdown restrictions because this was in the time of COVID and that because of that he was arresting her. What he actually did was to drive her all the way down to Kent, grape her and then strangle her to death with his police belt. If I've got you hooked on the video so far, viewer, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. Only 5 days later though, the police were at his home, placing him under arrest and interrogating him in relation to the abduction of Sarah Everard. Because Couzens was so wholly unprepared for being caught, he came up with the most ridiculous explanation of why he had kidnapped Sarah. He reckoned that he was pressurised into doing it by a gang that he owed money to. They told him that it was either get them a girl or have him and his family killed, and that he just felt he had no choice. Here is a brief clip of the stupid story that I've just said that he told the police.
Well, I am in financial shit, and I've been lent on by I don't know who they are. They're a group, a gang, whatever. And they told me, right, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them. There's a couple of names. I was told a place to take her. That's it. That is all I know.
There was a subsequent inquiry into the behaviour of Wayne Couzens during his career as a police officer, and it was concluded that there were so many missed opportunities to disrupt and halt the man's offending. He did things like flashing on a number of occasions. He was addicted to extreme pornography and tried to get his colleagues to watch it with him. He had a warning at one point for being excessively violent during an arrest. He went missing at one point. He was in loads and loads of debt, and when that happens, a police officer can be kicked out of the force because having money problems makes them more susceptible to bribery and corruption.
The inquiry has seen evidence that Couzens allegedly committed a very serious sexual assault against a child, barely in her teens, before his policing career even started. Problems with money also predated his career with the police. Couzens had substantial unsecured debt by the time he was arrested for Sarah's murder. At the same time, the Metropolitan Police Service were taking action to recover up to £15,000 that had been paid to him in error, and a year-long mortgage holiday was about to expire that month. It is alleged that on a number of occasions, Couzens tried to show friends and colleagues pornography, including some of a violent and extreme nature. It is further alleged that on at least 2 occasions, he shared unsolicited photographs of his penis with young women, and that he paid female online retailers to masturbate into clothes and send them to him. Since his conviction for Sarah's abduction, rape and murder, Couzens has been convicted of further crimes of indecent exposure, one of which he had already been linked to while a serving police officer.
As regards Couzens' acts of indecent exposure, did these serve as gateway offences for Couzens' subsequent act of murder?
The first of the offences in time involved A, who was cycling up a narrow country lane between Deal and Dover on the 13th of November 2020 at around 2:30 in the afternoon. Photographs of the lane in question show that it has a banked verge up one side with some woodland at the top. As A cycled up, a man stepped out from the trees. He was naked, energetically masturbating, his erect penis looking directly into A's eyes as he did so. From the photographs, he must have been less than 2 meters away from her as she passed. She could do nothing but cycle on, pedalling slowly up the hill past him as he continued to stand there manipulating his penis.
Mrs Justice May, the judge in charge of Couzens' sentencing for his acts of indecent exposure, who we've just been hearing from, implied that the man's having got away with those acts made him feel untouchable, which in turn gave him the sordid confidence to commit murder.
The fact that no police came to find him or his black car to question him about these incidents can only have served to confirm and strengthen in the defendant's mind a dangerous belief in his invincibility, in his power sexually to dominate and abuse women without being stopped.
Couzens got his whole life order in 2021. His appeal against that sentence that came in 2022 was swiftly dismissed.
Couzens seeks leave to appeal against sentence. In his case, we grant leave to appeal against sentence but dismiss the appeal.
Our next murderer doing a whole life order, killed with no provocation and no motive, to the shock and horror of the whole country.
You're just going to be searched, mate. You're not under arrest. I just need to search you.
We've had the case of Wayne Couzens, a police officer turned murderer. Now we've got the case of Louis De Zoysa.
At 13, he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. His lawyer argued the shooting was a result of an autistic meltdown.
When, on the 25th of September 2020, down in Croydon, South London, police stopped, searched and arrested 23-year-old data analyst Louis De Zoysa, they found that the man was carrying 7 bullets plus some cannabis. There was one other important thing that the man was carrying, though, that the police somehow missed.
Stand up, mate.
He's been a bit...
Go on.
Not understand.
I think this is it. You don't understand, stand up. So please leave. What? Please leave. I think I'm going to pass on. Okay, listen to me. My name's Matt, I'm the custody officer, right? I'm in charge. I'm not involved in the investigation. You've been arrested on suspicion of possession of bullets, ammunition and possession of intent to supply.
Class B.
Class B, anything else?
That's it.
Alright, your detention's not been authorised yet, but I can authorise a search of you under section 54 of PACE. Stand up. Mate, you're good enough to...
The 2 shots with which De Zoysa murdered Sergeant Matt Ratana came from the antique revolver that he was carrying on him, but as I say, the police missed it when they searched him on the street. Sergeant Matt Ratana left behind his partner and his child, and at the age of 55, he was only 3 months away from retirement. Of the 2 further shots that De Zoysa then fired, one got him himself in the neck and caused brain damage, as a result of which he's now in a wheelchair and can't communicate properly. Basically, he can't speak. When, at his sentencing hearing, he tried to use his physical disabilities as an argument for not being given a whole life order, the judge quite rightly pointed out that the man's physical disabilities are his own stupid fault.
On balance, I accept that you are likely to find prison more difficult than a neurotypical prisoner. I take that into account. Your injuries. After shooting Sergeant Matt Ratana twice, you fired 2 more shots. One hit the wall of the cell, mercifully missing the 2 officers who were bravely restraining you. The 4th hit you in the neck. This resulted in bleeding and a blood clot, which travelled to your brain and has caused some damage. It has also resulted in physical problems. It means you now use a wheelchair, and you have real problems with your communication, often using a whiteboard to help you communicate. It is entirely due to your deliberate and voluntary actions that you have those injuries.
De Zoysa got his whole life order in 2023, and then in 2025 his appeal against his whole life order was dismissed. Mark Bridger, our next murderer, did a lot more to his victim than to end her life. The body of 5-year-old April Jones, who came from Powys in North Wales, has never been found. The man who murdered her, father of 6 Mark Bridger, insists that he only killed April by accident and that, due to having been drunk at the time, he can't remember what he did with her body. On the evening of the 1st of October 2012, April Jones attended swimming lessons at a local leisure centre while her mother and father attended a parents' evening at her school. Afterwards, April invited a school friend of hers to come to her house. They were allowed to play outside with April's mother, Coral Jones, telling April not to be out for too long and then seeing her outside around 7:15 p.m. At 7:29 p.m. though, Coral was on the phone to the police in a state of total panic as she couldn't find her daughter anywhere. Less than 24 hours later, police came calling on a 46-year-old local man by the name of Mark Bridger. Born on the 5th of November 1965, Mark Bridger had a string of convictions stretching back to the mid-80s for mainly minor offences, except the one for battery and the one for assault, which came in 2004 and 2007 respectively. When he moved to Powys, he told people that he was ex-SAS. In reality, however, the man had only ever held casual or semi-skilled jobs and had never been in the army. Having, to remind you, all of 6 children, Bridger had no fewer than 4 baby mothers, including one to whom he had once been married. Bridger's story regarding April's disappearance was that he had accidentally run her over and then, heavily drunk, he'd taken her body somewhere but couldn't remember where. This story, however, didn't tally with the testimony of a 7-year-old girl, who we'll call Sarah, who had been nearby when April disappeared and who reported rather having seen April having a brief conversation with a man who was sitting inside a van before willingly climbing into the vehicle, smiling and happy. The vehicle turned out to be a Land Rover Discovery, and both the vehicle and Bridger matched the description that Sarah offered to the police. April's having been taken by someone in a car is also what Coral had reported when she called the police. Bridger's response to Sarah's testimony was to deny it. So, was Sarah lying or even innocently mistaken while Bridger himself was telling the truth? Shortly after the man's arrest for April's abduction, police discovered an extensive collection of child you-know-what on the man's computer, a discovery that the man tried to play down when the police probed him about it, claiming not to be in any way aroused by it, while also claiming, in some cases, not to even remember searching for the material. More importantly, where April's disappearance was concerned though, police found Bridger's home freshly bleached. But with their forensic tracing techniques, they were no less able to find samples of April's blood in the man's front room and bathroom, while a search of the man's fireplace turned up 17 fragments of April's skull. Police later revealed their belief that the perpetrator simply disposed of April's body in various locations in the North Wales countryside. Running from October 2012 to April 2013, the search for April, which was carried out quite surprisingly, despite the evidence indicating that the little girl was dead, was the largest missing person search in UK police history. Sticking with his story about having run April over and admitting that he was, quote, probably responsible, unquote, for the little girl's death, in January 2013, Bridger pleaded not guilty to both April's abduction and murder. On the 30th of May 2013 at Mold Crown Court, Mr Justice Griffith Williams directed the following words of disgust and condemnation at Bridger. You are a pathological and glib liar and a PDF file who has for some time harboured SE bleep XUAL and morbid fantasies about young girls. What prompted you on Monday the 1st of October 2012 to live out one of those fantasies is a matter for speculation. April would not have been afraid of you, partly because you have some charm and she may well have seen you about the estate, and probably because you let her know that your son was a friend of her brother, just as you had tried to charm her sister into allowing you to be her Facebook friend by mentioning your links to her parents. I can't infer from the evidence where you murdered her, but if she was alive when you took her to the house, she died there. How you disposed of her body must remain a mystery. The grief of April's parents cannot be overstated. They lived with the torment of a missing daughter. To add to that torment, they have had to endure the spectacle of your hypocritical sympathy for their loss and of your tears, flowing not because of any regret for your crimes, but because of your enduring self-pity. End of quotation. Sarah wasn't lying then. The perpetrator was. The jury delivered a guilty verdict the very day after the trial, meaning on the 30th of May 2013, while the judge gave Bridger his whole life prison sentence straight after that. Given the cause of this whole life sentence, if we can't lock all murderers up for absolutely ever, shouldn't every child murderer at least get a whole life order? Share your answer in a comment because I'm interested. Our next murderer carried out, with the help of his accomplice, a public execution on the streets of Woolwich down in South London. On the afternoon of the 22nd of May 2013, a British Army soldier, drummer Lee Rigby of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, was attacked and killed by Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale near the Royal Artillery Barracks in Woolwich, South East London. Both men were Muslim converts, and their murder of Lee Rigby was an act of protest against the atrocities, as they saw them, being committed by the British Army against citizens of Muslim countries. 29-year-old Adebolajo was found guilty of Mr Rigby's murder on the 19th of December 2013, and so was Adebowale. Adebolajo, however, held a greater share of liability for the murder of father of one Mr Rigby, such as is reflected in his sentence compared to that of Adebowale, the sentence details coming soon. The youngest of Adebolajo's 6 children, a little girl, was but 4 days old when, alongside an accomplice, her father went and ran over an innocent man who happened to be in the army before hacking him to death with knives and with a cleaver. In response to the arrival, around 5 minutes later, of armed police officers, the 2 murderous maniacs, who were armed with a gun as well as with the said bladed articles, charged at the police. As a result of the gunfire that they each suffered from the police, the 2 killers were hospitalised, Adebowale having had one of his thumbs shot off. In contrast, and thankfully, no police officers were harmed. The calm and coherent way in which Adebolajo explained during his first court appearance his motives for his horrific act, revenge for the killing of Muslims overseas by British soldiers, as I mentioned earlier, offered a stark contrast to the notably stilted but no less bravado-laden speaking that he did in his police interview.
We decided to wait in the vicinity of the barracks that is in Woolwich. By the qadr of Allah, by Allah's decree, whilst waiting to find a soldier, because between us we decided that the soldier is the most fair target because he joins the army with kind of an understanding that your life is at risk when you join the army, you know. So we sat in wait, and it just so happened that he was the soldier that was spotted first.
On the 26th of February 2014, at the Old Bailey, Adebowale got life with a minimum of 45 years, while Adebolajo got his whole life order. In a rather shocking piece of news, 4 years later, Adebolajo expressed regret for doing what he did to Lee Rigby. He said his justification for his act, coming as it did from the Quran, was a misinterpretation of the Quran and that he'd been brainwashed. Lee Rigby's mother, though, whose name is Lynn Rigby, rejected his apology and said that she'd never forgive him. Our next murderer was a serial killer in the making with the sickest and most twisted mind you've ever heard of. The act of murder perpetrated by 22-year-old Jamie Reynolds, a shop worker from Shropshire in the West Midlands, against 17-year-old Georgia Williams, a policeman's daughter, on the 26th of May 2013, came from the antagonist's long-held sexual fantasies and their long-planned moment of fulfilment. Reynolds dreamed of, and planned, and fulfilled a scenario in which, after hanging a girl until she died, he would indulge in necro-thingy with her corpse. In preparation for these acts, the perpetrator bought the clothing in which the girl would be dressed, the rope that he would use to hang her, and the handcuffs with which he would restrain her and make her helpless. Likewise, he built a hanging mechanism from the loft aperture in his home, the noose being slung over an oar placed across the opening and tied at one end to the banisters. When the man invited Georgia, his friend, over to his home on the pretext of having her do a photo shoot with him, this coming when his parents went away for a week, Georgia willingly accepted. She fully trusted him then when he persuaded her to dress in the clothes that he had bought, to stand on a box underneath the loft aperture, to have the noose placed around her neck, and to submit to being restrained by the use of handcuffs while he photographed her over and over. Sometime in, Reynolds suddenly pulls the noose tight, using considerable force to do so, securing Georgia's death by hanging, by forcing her backwards, using his knee in her back as a lever, and no doubt kicking away the box on which she'd been standing. He then, as he had envisaged, enjoyed the spectacle of her final ghastly minutes as she struggled for life, knowing that she'd been betrayed and that she was facing death. Minutes later, he was taking photographs of his victim lying dead on a bed, and then he was taking further photographs of his acts of essay on the body. He then spent an hour repeatedly graping the body before transporting it downstairs into the living room, where he then spent the next few hours violating it time and again. He photographed himself naked with the similarly naked corpse several times. After being arrested up in Glasgow, Scotland, 6 days later, where he'd scarpered to after dumping Georgia's body in a remote area near Wrexham in North Wales, Reynolds denied guilt for Georgia's murder all the way up to the 2nd of December, day one of his trial, when he changed his plea to guilty. When Reynolds did what he did to Georgia, he had on his computer 16,800 images and 72 videos, all depicting violent you-know-whatography. Some of the images were of Georgia herself and of other girls that he knew, with a noose digitally added to their necks. The man had been twice reported to the police for violent attacks on girls and had several agencies involved with him over his dark behaviour and interests, but was, quite shockingly, mainly left to his own devices, while people in his life, including Georgia of course, were left without notice of his disturbing ways. While the media claimed that Georgia's murder could have been prevented if the police and all social services had intervened with Reynolds beforehand, Mr. Justice Wilkie, who was in charge of Reynolds' trial, said the young man had the potential to progress into become a serial killer and was likely to remain a danger to women for the rest of his life. These assertions of his came from the psychiatrist reports provided to him ahead of the perpetrator's sentencing hearing. At one point, Reynolds was planning a second appeal against his whole life order, his first appeal from October 2014 having failed, clearly, but nothing has so far come of that. He got his whole life order on the 19th of December 2013. Our next murderer has quite a lot in common with Jamie Reynolds. Around 5 p.m. on Sunday the 26th of November 2000, on her way through an isolated and unlit path known as Howley Gill, Leanne Tiernan, a 16-year-old schoolgirl who came from Bramley in Leeds, West Yorkshire, disappeared. She took the said path as a shortcut home after going Christmas shopping with her friend, Sarah Whitehouse. The man who grabbed Leanne from behind, forced her over to his house, essayed her and then strangled her to death with a scarf and a cable tie was, like Jamie Reynolds, long obsessed with tying women up, sexually bleep-ating them, and then murdering them in a notably up-close and personal way. The search for Leanne became the largest that West Yorkshire had ever carried out. More than 1,000 properties were searched, a 3-mile stretch of canal was drained, and rubbish collections were halted while police looked for Leanne. Leanne's family made public appeals, and police released an e-fit of a man who'd been seen walking a small dog in the area. The man wasn't a regular dog walker in the area, but he'd been seen several times near where Leanne went missing before her disappearance. He hadn't been seen walking his dog in that area since Leanne's disappearance, however. Leanne's body was found 8 months later in Lindley Woods in North Yorkshire, several miles away from the crime scene, by a local dog walker called Mark Bisson. The body was wrapped in a duvet cover and in green dustbin liners. The head was covered by a black plastic bag, which was held in place by a dog collar. A scarf and a plastic cable tie had been tied around the neck, while the wrists were tied together with cable ties. What the body didn't offer up, though, was any DNA belonging to the perpetrator. Even so, police went to great lengths to trace people in Bramley who had bought a dog collar matching the one found on Leanne's body. They contacted more than 100 pet shops and suppliers before they were successful, and eventually made contact with a company who kept computerised records of all customers, including those supplied by mail order. One of those customers had bought a number of dog collars similar to the one found on Leanne's body, and he lived in Bramley. His name was John Taylor. When the same name appeared from 2 separate lines of inquiry, it was impossible to ignore. John Taylor became the prime suspect. Upon further inquiries, police discovered that 44-year-old John Taylor, who was born in 1958, was a parcel force employee and lived within a mile of where Leanne was abducted. Taylor was known locally as the Pet Man. He had kept various animals at home, such as dogs and ferrets, and was a keen poacher. He was divorced with children. The fact that John Taylor worked at Parcel Force was also significant, as some of the cable ties found on Leanne's body were supplied almost exclusively to Parcel Force's parent company, Royal Mail. Police began searching Taylor's house with a fine-tooth comb. They found cable ties and a dog collar, identical to those found with Leanne's body. They also found some pink carpet fibres that matched ones that had been found on Leanne's jumper, and some of Leanne's blood under some of the floorboards. Police were spot on when, given the methodical way in which Taylor had carried out Leanne's murder and then successfully covered it up for as long as he had, they surmised that Leanne's murder wasn't the man's first violent crime. On the 18th of October 1988, armed with a mask and a knife, Taylor attacked a 32-year-old woman as she walked across some waste ground near Howley Gill. After forcing her to commit an sexual act on him, disguising words, YouTube doesn't like certain words, he raped her. 5 months later, on the 1st of March 1989, again wearing a mask and armed with a knife, the man broke into a 21-year-old woman's Bramley home. It was lunchtime and the woman's 18-month-old baby was in another room at the time. Taylor forced the woman into her bedroom, undressed her, blindfolded and gagged her, forced her to perform a sexual act on him, and then raped her, exactly as he had done to his first victim. The exact details of the man's attacks on a further 5 women and girls, all carried out between 1977 and 1996, and involving no fewer than 16 offences, I wasn't able to trace. But they were sadistic sex attacks, all right. When police questioned some of Taylor's ex-girlfriends furthermore, the women revealed stories of Taylor's love of tying women up, his unusual fantasies, and his love of sadomasochistic sex. One woman said that Taylor had told her of his desire to have sex with her 15-year-old daughter. Violence against animals is often a characteristic of murderers, and police soon found evidence of Taylor's lengthy history of cruelty against the many ferrets and dogs that he had owned. When Leanne's body was found, it had only been in Lindley Woods for a short time. What nobody can confirm, though, is whether Taylor's act of storing the body in his freezer for the many months before he dumped it in Lindley Woods, as he had done, was to avoid detection for the murder or to have it as a trophy of the murder. Taylor got his life sentence for Leanne's kidnap and murder, both of which he had pleaded guilty to in July 2002, then another sentence in April 2003 for his 2 acts of grape from the late 80s, and then in October 2018 he got a whole life prison sentence coming from all his other offending, the SEX attacks that he committed on 5 other women and girls between 1977 and 1996. Our next murderer, another stalker and rapist, has one official murder on his record and yet arguably was responsible for 2. In May 2005, A-level student Jeshma Raithatha, who was but 3 days away from her 18th birthday, was on her way home in Greenford, West London, when she was strangled, raped and then beaten to death. The perpetrator was 42-year-old Latvian national Viktor Dembovskis, who had raped more than once before. Like John Taylor, Dembovskis had been lying in wait for a victim. Crouching in his bolt hole in dark undergrowth in woods near Sudbury, West London, he was hidden. And yet the unwashed and stinking Dembovskis enjoyed an unrestricted view of the road ahead. He watched, he waited, panting with nervous excitement as he gripped the shaft of a 9-inch knife. He didn't have long to wait. Jeshma Raithatha was making her way home to Greenford, having spent the day revising for her upcoming A-levels at nearby Claremont High School. The student, described as delightful, sensitive, caring and creative, had the world at her feet. When she wasn't nosed down in textbooks, the 17-year-old was planning a professional singing career and applying for university. As she stepped off the bus around 3 p.m. on May the 16th, 2005, her thoughts might have been on her upcoming holiday to the Canary Islands. She never got to take that trip, or to further her studies, however. As she made her way through a park behind a leisure centre, Dembovskis pounced. Jeshma was just 500 yards away from her home. During a frenzied attack which lasted an hour, she was mercilessly throttled, losing consciousness while frantically trying to fight off her assailant, who then raped her. And then, to ensure that Jeshma could never reveal his identity, Dembovskis stabbed her twice in the neck and 3 times in the heart. Jeshma's body was discovered 8 days later on May the 24th. Dembovskis had only arrived in Britain in November of the previous year when Latvia joined the EU, which granted the perpetrator right of entry, and he'd been working at a car wash. When Jeshma's disappearance became a murder hunt, the man had fled back to his homeland to lie low at his mother's house in poverty-stricken Livani, just 100 miles east of the capital Riga. But it didn't take long before police came knocking on his door, and investigating officers soon discovered Dembovskis' guilt. The man had vanished from a house that he'd shared with a dozen other immigrants, having robbed 370 quid from a roommate. His former housemates described how the man had been trying to hide scratch marks on his face. In addition, detectives soon found a zip-up fleece that he'd left in London, which contained 2 blood-streaked necklaces belonging to Jeshma. The man had even left a set of his keys next to Jeshma's body. Dembovskis was then extradited to Britain, and his trial at the Old Bailey began on the 14th of March 2006, where he denied the charges against him despite the overwhelming evidence against him. It was during his trial that the man's gruesome crime record in Latvia was revealed. Prosecuting counsel Jonathan Laidlaw told the court that in June 1990, Dembovskis followed a lady called Anastasia Skadinia as she was crossing a bridge. He put a knife to her throat and said, "I want you or I'll cut you. Don't scream, nobody will help you." He then dragged the woman to a riverbank and raped her at knife point. He got 7 years for that rape. However, within weeks of his release, which came in 1997, he was stalking his next prey. This time round, he targeted a young lady called Svetlana Dolbikova, who was 19 and who was also 3 months pregnant. The The woman would later say, "He held a knife to me while he groped me. I screamed at him, 'I'm pregnant,' but he didn't care." 2 months after doing what he did to Svetlana, Dembovskis struck again, this time dragging a lady called Ineta Maloseva into a filth-strewn basement as they walked home together from a party. He groped her. Shuddering, she told his trial, "He pushed me to the wall and put a kitchen knife to my neck, drawing blood. I will never forget the foul smell in that basement. His body was covered with a skin infection and he smelled of sweat." Incredibly, despite being sentenced to serve another 7 years in jail, the man was freed early in 2000 when an appeal judge ruled that because Ineta had been friends with one of the man's previous victims, Svetlana, she'd been foolish to go near him. There's an important reason why, in this country at least, generally speaking, judges don't blame the victims. It's because the victims are blameless. The people to blame for a criminal offence are the criminals. Anyway, back at the Old Bailey, it took just 3 hours for jurors to find Dembovskis guilty of murder and of 2 counts of rape. The judge, Peter Beaumont, told Dembovskis that he would die in prison. Jeshma's parents, Suresh and Manjula, wept in court. Conversely, all throughout the proceedings, Dembovskis had been seen laughing and sneering. Furthermore, 3 years after the trial, the man's vile crime against Jeshma would haunt the Raithatha family further. In April 2009, Jeshma's kid sister, Nishma, who was 16 and who simply couldn't cope with the horrific fate that her sister had suffered, leapt to her death from the top of a car park. Now, sorry, but you haven't heard the worst of the stories in this presentation yet, because the next story will, I'm sorry, haunt you for absolutely ever. Andrew Randall, a 33-year-old from Kettering in Northampton, murdered his own daughter to fulfil his twisted fantasy about controlling women, the man having admitted to thinking about killing the girl, whose name was Jessica, literally from the day that she was born. This means that the perpetrator had been contemplating murdering Jessica for 7 weeks. And yes, that means what you think it means. Randall murdered Jessica on the 21st of November 2005 by throwing her head first into the wooden arm of a settee. Having an obsession with serial killers as well as a fascination with horror films, Randall had fantasised about imprisoning, torturing and killing women since the age of 12. Stamping on the chest of his 5-week premature baby daughter, who had a heart defect, kicking her across the floor, ramming his fingers down her throat and committing essay on her were amongst the acts of violence and torture that the man perpetrated against the baby, Jessica being found after her death to have at least 9 injuries to her ribs as well as bleeding on the brain, a fractured skull and cuts to her face. In police interviews, Randall told officers of his resentment towards his daughter, resentment that he'd harboured against her from the start of her life, and how he'd thought about killing her every single day, and that he did what he did to the baby because he had the power to do so. He knew he was causing his daughter a great amount of pain and that she was in danger from him. In the weeks before Jessica's death, together with the baby's mother, Sharon Park, a schizophrenic, the perpetrator had taken Jessica to Kettering General Hospital, to out-of-hours doctor services and to her local GP on numerous occasions. While nurses and health workers noticed the worrying lack of bonding between the parents and the baby, only weekly visits to the family flat in Havelock Street in Kettering were arranged. As regards Sharon, Jessica's mother, I can't find any records indicating criminal liability on her part. She doesn't appear to have been charged with causing or allowing the death of a child, for instance. While it seems that she lived with both Randall and their baby, all I can say about her response to Randall's violence towards Jessica was that she did nothing about it. She was aware of it, we can safely assume, accompanying Randall to the hospital and to the GP with the baby. Whether her mental sickness, schizophrenia, exempted her from liability for the violent acts perpetrated on her baby daughter by the father, I just won't speculate on. The Safeguarding Board for Northamptonshire admitted that opportunities had been missed to identify signs of abuse against Jessica and that the outcome for the baby may have been different if those signs had been acted on. They also affirmed that, as early as the 12th of October 2005, there were grounds for a referral to Children and Young People Service, CYPC, due to Jessica's mother's previous history of mental health problems. Moreover, by the 15th of November, 6 days before Jessica died, by being murdered by her father, there were significantly more concerns, and some formal discussion should have been made with the CYPC, which is part of Northamptonshire County Council. The safeguarding team also observed, however, that Jessica's father didn't have a criminal record and that there was nothing in his medical records to suggest that he was a danger to his baby daughter. The obvious counter-arguments to those defences, though, which for many, I think, defeat those defences, are all the things that the Safeguarding Board themselves said before. In March 2007, Randall got his whole life order. In August 2011, he got an eye removed, his head stabbed and his throat slashed by a fellow inmate of HMP Long Lartin by the name of Jason J, a convicted murderer. We can't praise Jay, but we can be glad that Randall was nearly killed, suffered huge amounts of pain, has had his day-to-day made massively difficult, and that those difficulties will last forever. We're not celebrating the acts of violence perpetrated against him, we're celebrating his resultant suffering. I don't know why Jay, a murderer himself to remind you, did what he did, but he openly stated that he was in no way sorry and didn't care in the slightest when he was handed his 20-year sentence for the attack on Randall. Our next murderer, though, is another child murderer. In the early hours of the 20th of January 2013, 33-year-old Anwar Rosser, an ex-soldier, murdered a 4-year-old boy by the name of Riley Turner up in Keighley, West Yorkshire. Riley was the son of a couple, Sharon Smith and Guy Earwaker, who were friends with Rosser, the perpetrator carrying out the murder in the couple's very home after they let him stay the night. Sharon and Guy had met Ross through a mutual friend and had treated him with kindness during the time that they had known him, even helping him to furnish his own flat. On the night of the 19th of January 2013, Rosser turned up at the couple's home drunk, but fully coherent and in control of his actions, with 2 women. After the women left, he asked to stay the night, claiming that there were people outside waiting to beat him up as he owed them money. When the couple agreed to let him sleep on their sofa, they didn't know that he was carrying a knife that he had stolen from a pub where he worked as a part-time chef. When, around 4 a.m, the man went upstairs, entered the bedroom of the couple's 4-year-old son and repeatedly stabbed him, however, he was carrying a further 3 knives which came from the kitchen. At around 4:30 a.m, Sharon woke up to find Rosser at the side of her bed, curled up into a ball with his head down. She woke Guy, who duly ordered the man straight out of the house, the perpetrator responding by hastily leaving the room and going downstairs, but choosing not to leave but to wait for the couple to discover what he'd done to their little boy. That happened a few minutes later. There were 30 separate stab and incised wounds to multiple parts of Riley's body. These included 14 stab and incised wounds to the neck, including a large stab wound to the centre of the neck, which penetrated deeply and severed the windpipe. 2 additional stab wounds penetrated deeply into that large wound and partially severed his spine. In addition, there were 5 stab wounds to the back, 5 stab wounds to the chest, which penetrated the lungs, one of which completely transfixing the lung, 6 stab wounds to the abdomen, and 1 stab wound to the left side of the scrotum, which was deep and severe. There was also evidence that repeated rectal insertions had been performed, which were associated with multiple penetrating injuries to the bowel wall. They were associated with some significant hemorrhage into the adjacent tissues, which indicated that Rosser inflicted them while the little boy was alive or near the time of his death, or at the time of his death. A marker pen was found within the boy's rectum, and a coat hanger, which was later recovered and which had traces of his faeces and blood, had been inserted into the little boy's bottom hole as well to a substantial depth. In addition, there was a deep bite mark on the outside of Riley's upper left thigh, coming of course from Rosser. Having enlisted into the 5 Regiment Royal Artillery at the age of 16, but never having seen active service, Rosser had a history of alcohol-inspired violence. But when he butchered 4-year-old Riley Turner, despite being drunk, he was in full control of his behaviour. The reason for his murderous assault on the little boy remains as such a mystery. The extreme and devastating betrayal of the kindness that the boy's parents had shown the perpetrator was a substantial aggravating factor in the man's sentencing. Rosser got his whole life order at Bradford Crown Court in February 2014. And now for another case where a treacherous and savage murder of a child came from the influence of extreme you-know-whatography. On the 3rd of April 2010, 38-year-old John Maden drugged 12-year-old Tia Rigg before raping her, torturing her and murdering her. Tia was the daughter of the perpetrator's sister, his very own niece. At 2:17 p.m. on the 3rd of April 2010, Maden, who had an obsessive interest in bleepography relating to you-know-whatophilia, rape and torture, phoned his sister, Tia's mother, and asked if Tia could come over to his home in Dalmain Close, Cheetham Hill in Greater Manchester, in order to babysit his 10-year-old daughter. When Tia arrived at 3 p.m, he drugged her with olanzapine, an antipsychotic tranquilizer that he had been prescribed. He then inflicted a horrific catalogue of sexual injuries on her before stabbing her and then strangling her with a ligature made from a guitar string. At 3:45 p.m, the man phoned 999 and said, "Hi, I would like to report a murder." He then gave his name and address, and then when he was asked by the operator what had just happened, he replied, "My niece has been murdered by me. I've just finished killing her now." When the operator then asked him why he killed her, he said, "Because I felt like it," and then hung up. Police officers arrived at the address 2 minutes later. Maden opened the door to the officers, who described him as chillingly calm, and then directed them upstairs. They found Tia's body face up on the floor of a spare bedroom. It was naked except for her socks, and the ligature was still fastened around her neck, while her hands were still tied behind her back with shoelaces. Next to the body were 2 knives, a broom handle and a sex toy, all of which were stained with blood. An autopsy found that Tia had suffered severe blood loss from her stab wounds and also from internal injuries, but that the primary cause of her death was ligature strangulation. Maden was tried at Manchester Crown Court on the 4th of October 2010. Prosecutor Gordon Cole QC told the court, "In the year or so prior to April this year, the defendant had developed what can properly be described as an obsessive interest in images and literature relating to bleepophilia, rape and torture. He had an extensive library of such materials, which included literature dealing with methods of killing." On Maden's laptop, police had found hundreds of extreme images of child you-know-what and violent bleepography. Meanwhile, on his mobile phone, they had found loads and loads more material of that kind, and they'd been stored in folders named Snuff, Snuff Stories and Brutal Grape. DCI David Warren, who led the investigation, revealed that Maden refused to explain his actions beyond just having felt like doing what he did, and that he had never shown any remorse for the killing. After Maden pleaded guilty to rape and murder, Mr Justice Keefe told him, "It is inescapable that Tia Rigg died because you decided to realise your fantasies about torturing and killing a young child. It is difficult to know how long Tia's ordeal lasted. The terror, the unimaginable pain that you inflicted on her, the indignities to which you subjected her while she was alive, it was planned, it was premeditated, and her agony must have been prolonged. This is one of those exceptional cases in which the only just punishment requires you to be imprisoned for the rest of your life." Maden therefore got his whole life prison sentence in October 2010. In a very sad twist to this story, Tia, who had been placed on the at-risk register even before she was born, was deemed to have been a victim of serious failings by social service agencies who were meant to have protected her, social workers having missed as many as 7 chances to rescue Tia. Tia's mother, you see, Lee Rigby, who had 7 children by 4 different fathers, had an ongoing history of heroin and cocaine addiction and a criminal record for robbery and assault. The report into Tia's murder said that there were 7 incidents, as I mentioned just now, which should have prompted Children's Services to consider taking Tia and her siblings into care, which included, for a start, her mother's act of attempting suicide in front of her children. Lynn frequently left her kids home alone, and there were often moments of violence between family members at her home in Salford. The report said social workers had an over-optimistic and unrealistic perception of Lynn's ability to care for her children and failed to appreciate the chaos of Tia's family life. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.